A car just crashed through my roof, except it didn't crash. Someone put it there. Right now, 20 feet above my driveway, the HOA president's Lexus is parked on top of my cabin like some kind of bizarre art installation. She screamed so loud that the whole neighborhood came running. This woman tried to steal my grandfather's house with bogus fines and fake violations. What she didn't know? The old man had secretly engineered the perfect revenge before he died. Quick question, where are you watching from? Comment below, because when I show you how we got a 2-ton car onto my roof, you won't believe this actually happened. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, nestled at the edge of Redwood Creek Estates like a stubborn reminder of what this place used to be before the HOA moved in. My grandfather, Arthur Sr., built it with his own hands back in the 1960s, long before anyone thought to slap rules on mailbox colors or grass height. He was an engineer, the kind who kept everything documented in thick leather journals that lined the shelves of his workshop. I used to think he was just obsessive about record keeping, but looking back now, I realize he was preparing for something. The man planned for everything, from foundation settling to roof load calculations to apparently dealing with future tyrants. Those journals were everywhere in the cabin, filled with sketches, calculations, and notes written in his precise handwriting. I moved in 3 months after his funeral, my truck loaded with boxes and a heart full of memories. The place still smelled like him, machine oil, sawdust, and that particular brand of pipe tobacco he'd sworn he'd quit but never did. I was 32, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start. What I got instead was Carol Whitmore, president of the Redwood Creek Estates Homeowners Association, standing on my porch 2 days later with a store-bought apple pie and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was in her mid-50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair that defied the mountain breeze, wearing what I'd soon learn was her uniform, pressed slacks, a blazer, and pearls that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. The welcome mat under her designer shoes seemed to shrink as she stood there. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, handing me the pie while her eyes swept over the cabin like a tax assessor calculating values. "I'm Carol Whitmore, HOA president. We're so pleased to have new blood in the community." The way she said new blood made me feel less like a neighbor and more like a meal. She stayed for 20 minutes, asking questions about my plans for the property, commenting on the rustic charm of the cabin in a tone that suggested rustic was a disease that needed curing. Her eyes lingered on the hand-carved shutters, the natural wood siding, the stone chimney my grandfather had built, rock by rock. "Of course, we have standards here at Redwood Creek," she mentioned casually as she left. "I'll send over our community guidelines. Just a little light reading." 3 days later, I found a handwritten note tucked into my mailbox. "Just a friendly reminder that HOA guidelines specify mailboxes should be hunter green or black. Yours appears to be forest green. No rush, but we do like to maintain standards." The exclamation point somehow made it worse, like she was excited about mailbox colors. I compared my mailbox to the guidelines and couldn't see a difference between forest and hunter green, but I figured I'd deal with it later. The next week brought another note, this time about grass height. Apparently, my lawn had committed the cardinal sin of growing a 1/4 inch above the regulated 2 3/4 inches. The fine was $50, my first official welcome to the neighborhood. That's when the roof started leaking. The spring storm had been brutal, and I'd noticed a water stain spreading across the ceiling of the main bedroom. I grabbed my tools and headed up to assess the damage, figuring I'd handle it like my grandfather taught me, quickly and properly. I'd been up there for maybe an hour, pulling off damaged shingles and checking the underlayment, when I heard a camera click. Carol stood in my driveway, phone raised, documenting my work like a crime scene photographer. "Just keeping records," she called up cheerfully. "You did file for architectural approval before starting roof work, didn't you?" The question hung in the air like a trap I'd already stepped in. I climbed down to talk to her, explaining about the leak, the urgency of repairs, and the water damage that would occur if I waited. She listened with that same smile, nodding sympathetically while typing notes into her phone. "I understand completely," she said. "But rules are rules. Any structural modifications require written approval from the architectural committee. You'll need to submit plans, wait for review, attend a hearing." She rattled off a process that would take weeks while my roof leaked. "Of course, you'll need to stop work immediately and restore the roof to its original condition before we can even consider your application." By original condition, she meant putting the damaged shingles back on. The fine came 2 days later, $1,000 for unauthorized structural modifications and a cease and desist order. I stood in my kitchen, water now dripping steadily into a bucket from my unfinished roof, staring at this piece of paper that felt less like a violation notice and more like a declaration of war. $1,000 for trying to fix my own roof in a cabin my grandfather built with his bare hands before this HOA even existed. The most insulting part was the final line. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in additional fines and possible legal action. This wasn't about regulations anymore. This was personal. So the question becomes, what do you do when a queen declares war on your tiny kingdom? The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a building that looked like it was designed by someone who thought beige was too exciting. I arrived 10 minutes early, armed with photographs, contractor estimates, and a determination to resolve this reasonably. The room was already half full, mostly retirees who treated these meetings like social events. Carol stood at the front, arranging papers with the precision of a general preparing battle plans. But before my issue came up, I witnessed something that explained everything about how this place really worked. Alina Rodriguez, a quiet woman in her 40s who served as HOA secretary, approached Carol with what looked like meeting minutes. She spoke softly, pointing to something on the page. Carol's response echoed through the room like a whip crack. "Elena, how many times do I have to explain this? The minutes need to be formatted exactly as I've shown you. This is completely unacceptable." She held up the papers like evidence of a crime, her voice dripping with condescension. "The font is wrong, the margins are off, and you've abbreviated Homeowners Association when it should be spelled out in full. If you can't handle basic secretarial duties, perhaps we need to reconsider your position on the board." Elena's face flushed deep red as she mumbled an apology and retreated to her seat, hands shaking as she clutched her notepad. The room fell silent, everyone suddenly fascinated by their phones or the beige walls. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When my turn came to address the board about the roof situation, I stood with my carefully prepared presentation. I showed photos of the leak, the water damage already spreading, estimates showing the cost would triple if we waited. I explained calmly that this was a repair, not a modification, that the integrity of a 60-year-old structure was at stake. Carol listened with a smile that reminded me of a cat watching a mouse explain why it shouldn't be eaten. The other board members, 3 men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, kept glancing at Carol before looking away. Only Elena met my eyes, and what I saw there looked like sympathy mixed with resignation. "Mr. Hayes," Carol began when I finished, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "While we appreciate your enthusiasm for maintenance, rules exist for a reason. What if everyone just decided to modify their properties without approval? We'd have chaos, anarchy. Property values would plummet." She produced her own visual aids, photos of my roof with grid overlay. "According to our guidelines, replacing more than 25% of roofing material constitutes a structural modification. You removed approximately 31% of the shingles. Furthermore, your grandfather's original building permits from 1964 show cedar shakes. You were installing asphalt shingles, which is a material change requiring full architectural review." I tried to argue that my grandfather had already switched to asphalt in the 1980s, but Carol cut me off. "Without documented HOA approval of that change, we must consider cedar shakes as the baseline. Any deviation requires a full review process, including environmental impact studies, neighbor notifications, and a 60-day comment period." The other board members nodded along like synchronized swimmers, except Elena, who stared at her notepad. When it came time to vote on allowing me to continue emergency repairs, it was 4-1 against. Elena's lone yes vote earned her a look from Carol that could have frozen lava. After the meeting, I stood in the parking lot trying to process the surreal bureaucratic nightmare I'd just experienced. That's when Arthur Coleman shuffled over. In his 70s, Arthur had lived in Redwood Creek since before it was Redwood Creek, and he'd been my grandfather's closest friend. "Hell of a show in there," he said, leaning heavily on his carved walking stick. "Though if you knew the history, you'd understand why Carol's got her crosshairs on you specifically." He told me about a land dispute from the 1970s. Carol's father had tried to claim a stretch of creek frontage that my grandfather owned, arguing adverse possession. The case went to court, and Carol's family lost not only the claim, but also had to pay my grandfather's legal fees. "Carol was just a teenager then," Arthur continued, "but she idolized her daddy. When he lost that case, lost that land, and had to sell off 2 lots to pay the legal bills, she took it personal, been nursing that grudge ever since. When your grandpa passed and the cabin sat empty, she probably thought she'd finally won. Then you showed up. He patted my shoulder with a gnarled hand. Your grandpa knew she'd come for you eventually. Man was smart like that, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Before I could ask what he meant, Arthur shuffled away, leaving me with more questions than answers. A few days later, the situation escalated beyond fines and bureaucracy. A certified letter arrived requiring signature. The return address was a law firm in the state capital. Inside was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on my property for unpaid fines and violations. The letter detailed accumulated fines I didn't even know about: grass height, visible trash cans, a wheelbarrow that had been in my driveway for more than 24 hours, including interest and administrative fees. They claimed I owed over $10,000. The final paragraph was the gut punch. Failure to pay within 30 days would result in foreclosure proceedings. They weren't just harassing me anymore, they were coming for my home. So, how do you fight back when they're aiming at the one thing you can't afford to lose? The lien notice became my unwanted breakfast companion. $10,000 in fines, accumulated interest, and administrative fees that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Each morning I'd read through it again, hoping to find some error, some technicality that would make it all go away. But Carol had done her homework. Every fine was documented with photos, timestamps, and references to specific HOA bylaws. She'd been building this case from the day I moved in, maybe even before. The 30-day deadline loomed like a storm cloud. Pay up, comply with all demands, or lose the cabin my grandfather built. The lawyer I consulted was brutally honest. HOAs had more power than most people realized, and fighting them required deep pockets I didn't have. I found myself taking long walks through town, partly to clear my head and partly to escape the cabin that was starting to feel like a trap. At the hardware store, I overheard 2 contractors discussing Carol's latest victim. Poor Murphy family, one said, painted their door burgundy instead of approved red number 3, $500 fine, plus they have to repaint. His companion shook his head. Woman's gone mad with power. Ever since her husband took off with that dental hygienist, she's been making everyone miserable. At the coffee shop, similar stories. The Johnsons, fined because their daughter's bicycle was visible from the street. The Guayans, who received violation notices for holiday decorations that exceeded the approved square footage. Carol was an equal opportunity tyrant. The breaking point came hand-delivered. Carol herself appeared at my door on a Thursday morning, dressed in her usual armor of pressed slacks and pearls. She held out an envelope with the kind of smile worn by people who enjoy pulling wings off flies. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this, Caleb, she said, using my first name like we were old friends, but that eyesore shed has got to go. Public safety issue, you understand. No permits on file, non-conforming structure, and frankly, it's dragging down property values. The shed, my grandfather's workshop, where he'd taught me to measure twice and cut once, where his tools still hung on pegboards exactly as he'd left them, where 3 generations of projects had taken shape. You have 72 hours to demolish it, Carol continued, checking her phone like she had somewhere important to be. After that, we'll have our contractors remove it and add the cost to your bill. I'm thinking it'll run about $5,000, maybe $6,000 with disposal fees. She looked past me into the cabin, that cataloging gaze taking inventory. Oh, and those wooden shutters will need to go too. They're not on the approved architectural list. But one thing at a time, right? She click-clacked down my porch steps in her heels, leaving me holding another piece of paper that felt like a death warrant for my grandfather's legacy. I walked to the shed in a daze. Inside, everything waited exactly as he'd left it. The lathe where we'd turned table legs together, the workbench scarred by decades of projects, his tools, each one hung in its designated spot, outlined in marker so you'd know if something was missing. I picked up his favorite hammer, the handle worn smooth by his hands, and something inside me just broke. The tears came hard and sudden, all the frustration and helplessness pouring out in that dusty space that smelled like sawdust and memory. I was losing everything, piece by piece, to a bitter woman's vendetta, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The hammer slipped from my hand, hitting the wooden floor with a hollow thunk that didn't sound quite right. Through my tears, I noticed the board had bounced slightly, not damaged, just loose. I knelt down and saw the edges had been deliberately cut, creating an almost invisible removable panel. My fingers found the gaps and lifted. Underneath was a metal document box, and inside that, wrapped in plastic, was a leather-bound journal. My grandfather's handwriting filled page after page. At first, it looked like HOA meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence. Then I realized what I was reading. He'd been documenting everything for years, not just recent stuff, but going back decades. There were original HOA bylaws from 1994 that had been amended without proper votes. Financial records showed Carol had used HOA funds for personal expenses, hidden in maintenance budgets, correspondence between board members discussing ways to force out homeowners they didn't like. And then, bookmarked with a faded hardware store receipt, I found something that made me sit back on my heels. Article 15, Section 2, Vehicular Elevation Restrictions. No motorized vehicle shall be elevated above ground level within the community except with prior approval from the HOA Safety Committee. A bizarre rule from 1994, probably meant to prevent people from working on cars in their driveways. Never repealed, just forgotten. I flipped to the journal's last entry, dated just 2 weeks before my grandfather died. His handwriting was shakier but still precise. The cancer's winning, but I'll be damned if I let that harpy win too. Caleb will need help when Carol comes for him. Everything he needs is here. Contracts with Gunny's crane service, structural load calculations from the 2016 reinforcement, and the security footage from Carol's little midnight shopping sprees with the HOA credit card. At the bottom, in red ink, he'd written, "If that devil woman goes after the roof, implement Lexus contingency plan. Gunny knows what to do." I stared at those words, pieces clicking together in my mind. What in the hell was the Lexus contingency plan? I spent the next 3 hours in that shed, reading through my grandfather's journal like it was a sacred text. Each page revealed another layer of his meticulous planning. The man hadn't just kept records. He'd built an entire case file that would make a detective proud. There were bank statements showing Carol had authorized HOA funds to purchase a community vehicle for official business in 2018. That vehicle turned out to be a white Lexus SUV that somehow ended up being used exclusively by Carol. She'd hidden the purchase by breaking it into multiple transactions: office equipment for the down payment, maintenance supplies for the monthly installments, and emergency response resources for the insurance. My grandfather had photographed her driving it to yoga classes, shopping trips, and wine tastings, none of which seemed like official HOA business to me. But the financial fraud was just the beginning. The real treasure was in a folder labeled Structural Contingencies. Inside were professional engineering assessments of my cabin's roof, dated 2016. My grandfather had hired a structural engineer to evaluate and secretly reinforce the entire roof system. The reports showed installation of additional steel beam supports, doubled rafters, and military-grade connection plates. The final load calculation made me whistle. The roof could support over 20,000 pounds of distributed weight. There were photos of the construction work, permits filed with the county, and a handwritten note. Load test completed successfully, 2017. Supported Gunny's F-150 plus 3 tons of concrete blocks for 72 hours. Zero deflection, more than adequate for future requirements. The technical documents were thorough beyond belief. Pages of calculations, stress diagrams, and safety margins. My grandfather had even accounted for wind shear, snow load, and seismic activity. At the bottom of one page he'd written, "Carol's Lexus weighs approximately 4,500 pounds. With proper load distribution, the roof could hold 3 of them. But one should make the point effectively." It was like reading the blueprint for a practical joke designed by NASA. Every variable considered, every problem solved before it could arise. The man had turned structural engineering into an art form of revenge preparation. I found Gunny's business card stapled to a contract for specialized lifting operations, as discussed. Walter Morrison is the owner of Morrison Heavy Haul and Crane Services. The contract was prepaid through 2035, with provisions for emergency response within 4 hours of notification. There was even a hand-drawn diagram showing optimal crane positions, cable angles, and something labeled noise mitigation zones to avoid waking neighbors unnecessarily. My grandfather had thought of everything, including how to keep collateral annoyance to a minimum. This wasn't just a plan, it was a masterpiece of strategic thinking. The evidence of Carol's abuse of power filled 3 folders. Emails where she discussed targeting specific residents, financial irregularities going back years, and documented cases of selective bylaw enforcement. One email particularly stood out, where Carol wrote to another board member, "The Hayes cabin is an eyesore. Once the old man dies, we'll find a way to force the air out. I've waited 40 years to see that place demolished." The email was dated 2022, a full year before my grandfather passed. She'd been planning this before I even knew I'd inherit the cabin. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was a vendetta. But it was the final document that really stunned me. A sealed envelope marked "Open only when implementing Lexus contingency." Inside was a letter in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. "Caleb, if you're reading this, Carol has pushed too far. Everything you need is here. The roof will hold. Gunny will handle the lift. But timing is crucial. Wait until she's given you enough rope to hang her with. Let her commit fully to her attack. Document everything. When she files for foreclosure, that's your green light. The neighborhood needs to see her as the aggressor. Only then will they support what comes next. Remember, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And sometimes justice needs a little mechanical assistance. Love, Grandpa. P.S. Make sure someone films it." I sat back, overwhelmed by the thoroughness of his preparation. A thought struck me, and I started checking dates. The roof reinforcement was done in 2016, the test with Gunny's truck in 2017, the crane service contract signed in 2018. He'd been planning this for nearly a decade, refining each detail, waiting for the moment Carol would overreach. And now that moment had arrived. I picked up my phone and dialed Gunny's number. After 40 years, it was time to pay a debt. After 3 rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Morrison Heavy Haul, this Gunny." I took a deep breath. "Mr. Morrison, this is Caleb Hayes. I think it's time we discuss my grandfather's contingency plan." "Ah, damn," Gunny's laugh boomed through the phone. "I've been waiting for this call for 7 years. That woman finally pushed you too far, did she? Outstanding. When do we fly?" The enthusiasm in his voice was infectious. This wasn't just a job for him, it was a mission. "She's filed foreclosure papers," I told him, "given me 30 days to pay or lose everything." There was a pause, then Gunny's voice turned serious. "Then we move fast. Your grandfather always said timing was everything. Can't give her time to cover her tracks or spin the narrative. How about this Friday night? She'll be at her wine club, gets home around 11, and parks in the same spot every time like clockwork. We can have her car airborne before she finishes her nightcap." Friday, less than a week away. Was I really going to do this? Then I looked around the shed Carol wanted demolished, thought about the cabin she wanted to steal, and decided yes. Yes, I was. "Friday it is," I said. "Let's give the neighborhood a show they'll never forget." Tuesday morning, I met Gunny at his equipment yard to review the plan in detail. The place was a heavy machinery wonderland, cranes of every size, flatbeds that could haul houses, and equipment that looked like it belonged in a monster movie. Gunny himself was exactly what you'd expect from a Marine-turned-crane operator. 6'4", built like a linebacker, with arms that had Semper Fi tattooed on one side and Never Forget on the other. His office walls were covered with photos from Vietnam, commendations, and pictures of impossible lifting jobs. "Your grandfather saved my whole squad," he said without preamble. 69 outside Da Nang. We were pinned down, surrounded. He drove a jeep through enemy fire to get us ammo and cover our withdrawal. 2 bullet wounds and he still got us out. Been waiting to repay that debt ever since. Gunny spread out the plans on a table scarred by decades of use. We did a full test run in 2017. Lifted my old F-150 clean onto your roof, left it there for 3 hours to test the load. Your grandfather documented everything with an engineer present. He showed me photos, his battered pickup truck sitting on my roof like the world's strangest lawn ornament. Whole operation took 18 minutes from arrival to departure. The roof didn't even creak. That reinforcement job was solid gold. He traced the lift path with one massive finger. Carol's driveway to your roof is 47 feet horizontally, 32 feet vertically. Easy lift with the 100-ton crane. We'll use spreader bars to distribute the weight, soft straps to avoid damaging her precious paint job. Now, Gunny continued, your grandfather wanted this documented for posterity. Said something about the court of public opinion being as important as any legal court. You got anyone who can film this? That's when I remembered the security cameras my grandfather had installed. High defensive night vision, multiple angles covering the entire property. But we needed more than just security footage. We needed witnesses. I started making calls, first to Arthur, who laughed so hard he started coughing. I'll bring folding chairs, he wheezed. This is better than cable TV. Then Elena, who was initially horrified before admitting she'd love to see Carol taken down a peg, or several pegs, or launched into orbit. Word spread carefully through the neighborhood grapevine. Not everyone. We couldn't risk Carol getting wind of it, but enough people to ensure plenty of witnesses. The Murphys were in immediately. She fined us $500 for a door color that was practically identical to the approved shade, Mr. Murphy said. I'll bring popcorn. The Nyans, still smarting from being forced to take down their Lunar New Year decorations, promised to attend. Even mild-mannered Mr. Patterson, whose wife served on the board, admitted he'd had enough. "She made my wife cry at the last meeting," he said quietly, accused her of being too stupid to understand basic math. "Margaret has a PhD in accounting." Wednesday brought an unexpected ally. I was at the hardware store when someone tapped my shoulder. A young man, maybe 19, wearing a gaming headset around his neck. "You're Mr. Hayes, right? I'm Tommy Chen. I live 3 houses down from you." I recognized him vaguely. Quiet kid, kept to himself. "I heard about Friday," he said, glancing around nervously. I run a live stream, gaming mostly, but I've got followers who love crazy neighborhood drama. Would you mind if I filmed? I've got professional equipment, good low-light cameras." I stared at him for a moment, then remembered my grandfather's postscript. "Make sure someone films it. You know what, Tommy? That would be perfect." Thursday afternoon, Carol struck again, another violation notice, this time for excessive wildlife congregation because birds used the feeder in my yard. The fine was $200. Then another for unauthorized botanical modifications because I'd trimmed a bush without HOA approval. $300. She was accelerating her attack, trying to bury me in paper before the foreclosure deadline. Each notice was hand-delivered by Carol herself, always with that same shark smile. "Such a shame," she said, handing me the 4th notice of the day. "Your grandfather managed to follow the rules for decades. Genetics, I suppose. Some families just can't maintain standards." That night, I called Elena. "Are you sure about tomorrow?" I asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Her response surprised me. "I've been on that board for 5 years," she said. 5 years of watching Carol destroy people's lives over petty violations while she embezzles funds and breaks every rule that inconveniences her. I've got a folder of board meeting recordings where she admits to targeting specific residents. If tomorrow's show doesn't bring her down, I'm going to the state attorney general. We had an army. Not a big one, but motivated and ready. Gunny confirmed his crew was set. Tommy Chan had recruited 2 friends to help with camera angles. Arthur had contacted a buddy who worked for the local news, planting the seed that something newsworthy might happen Friday night. Friday morning dawned clear and cold. I walked through the cabin, touching familiar surfaces, breathing in the smell of wood and memory. Whatever happened tonight, things would never be the same. Win or lose, I was about to declare war on the HOA president in the most spectacular way possible. At noon, Carol delivered what she probably thought was the killing blow, a formal notice that the demolition crew would arrive Monday morning to destroy the shed. "For your safety," she purred. "We'd hate for someone to get hurt in that death trap." She had no idea she just activated the contingency plan my grandfather had spent years perfecting. But even the best plans can hit snags. What if Carol changed her routine? What if the crane broke down? What if? No, I pushed the doubts aside. Tonight, one way or another, this ended. By 6 o'clock Friday evening, social media was already buzzing. Tommy Chin had been dropping hints on his stream all week, and his followers were primed for something big. "Trust me, guys," I heard him telling his audience from his streaming setup in his garage. "What goes down tonight is gonna break the internet. #RoofLuxus, #HOA Justice. You're gonna want to screen record this." I didn't fully understand streaming culture, but apparently Tommy had 12,000 followers who lived for this kind of content. Carol, meanwhile, stuck to her routine perfectly. Her Lexus pulled out of the driveway at exactly 8:05, headed for the Redwood Creek Wine Club's Friday tasting. Like clockwork. The next 3 hours crawled by. I tried to stay busy, reviewing the plan, checking equipment, but mostly I paced. Around 10:30, vehicles started arriving quietly. Arthur pulled up with 3 folding chairs and a thermos of coffee. The Murphys brought their adult daughter home from college, specifically to witness this. Elena arrived with 2 other board members who'd secretly turned against Carol. Tommy Chen and his crew set up cameras at strategic angles, their equipment looking surprisingly professional. By 11:15, nearly 20 people had gathered in my yard, all trying to stay quiet and out of sight. The atmosphere was electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. At 11:27, Carol's Lexus turned onto our street. She was 12 minutes later than usual, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought she might park somewhere different. But no, she pulled into her usual spot, perfectly positioned as always. We watched her get out, slightly unsteady on her heels, and disappear into her house. The porch light went off. Interior lights flickered on, and then, one by one, went dark. By 11:45, the house was still. That's when the convoy arrived. Gunny had timed it perfectly. The massive crane rolled down our residential street like a metal dinosaur, followed by 2 support trucks. The crew moved with military precision, barely making a sound despite the size of their equipment. "Positions, everyone," Gunny whispered into his radio. The crane's stabilizers extended, its massive arm beginning to unfold against the night sky. Work lights blazed to life, turning Carol's driveway into a stage. Tommy Chen was already streaming, narrating in a hushed voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to witness is either the greatest HOA revenge in history or the most expensive prank ever attempted. The crane is in position. I repeat, the crane is in position." The chat was going insane. Views climbed from hundreds to thousands in minutes. Someone had already created a Wikipedia page for the Redwood Creek Lexus incident, though it was mostly blank, waiting to be filled. The rigging crew worked fast. Heavy straps slid under the Lexus with practiced ease. The crane operator, a woman who looked like she could arm wrestle Gunny and win, gave a thumbs up. "Package secure," crackled over the radio. "Ready for liftoff." This was it, the moment of truth. I nodded to Gunny, who spoke into his radio. "Execute, execute, execute." The crane's engine note changed, hydraulics hummed, and slowly, impossibly, Carol's 4,500-pound status symbol began to rise. The crowd held its breath. Someone whispered, "Holy shit, they're actually doing it." The Lexus rose smoothly, 10 feet, 20 feet, rotating slightly as it climbed. The work lights made it glow against the dark sky. Then several things happened at once. A teenager from down the street, someone's kid with a GoPro who'd been exploring the neighborhood, emerged from the shadows. "Whoa, what the hell?" He was filming everything, adding another angle we hadn't planned on. Dogs started barking, porch lights flicked on up and down the street, and then the main event. Carol's bedroom light blazed to life. We could see her silhouette appear at the window, stand frozen for a moment, then disappear. 10 seconds later, her front door burst open. She stood there in a silk bathrobe and slippers, her face a mask of disbelief as her Lexus sailed gracefully through the air toward my roof. "Stop!" she screamed, running toward the crane. "Stop this immediately! That's my car! This is theft! This is... Words failed her as the Lexus touched down on my reinforced roof as gently as a butterfly landing on a flower. The crowd erupted in applause. Tommy's stream chat was scrolling so fast it was unreadable. The kid with the GoPro was jumping up and down shouting, "This is sick! This is so sick!" Carol stood in my yard now, hair wild, makeup smeared, looking nothing like the composed HOA president who terrorized the neighborhood. "You'll pay for this!" she shrieked. "I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you into bankruptcy." I stepped forward, calm as a lake in August. "Actually, Carol, according to Article 15, Section 2 of the HOA bylaws you love so much, no motorized vehicle shall be elevated above ground level without prior approval. You violated that every time you had your car serviced on a lift. But more importantly," I held up a folder, "this vehicle was purchased with HOA funds. That's embezzlement. So before you call the police, you might want to consider that they'll be more interested in your financial crimes than my grandfather's revenge plan." The color drained from her face as she realized the trap she was in. Report the incident and expose her own crimes, or stay silent and lose her power. Elena stepped out of the crowd, holding a clipboard. "As secretary of the HOA board, I call for an emergency vote of no confidence in President Carol Whitmore." Hands shot up around the yard. Current board members, longtime residents, even people watching from their windows raised their hands. It was unanimous among those present. Carol stood in the middle of it all, watching her empire crumble in real time. The best part? Tommy's stream had gone mega viral. 20,000 viewers and climbing. The chat was full of people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Rough Lexus was trending. Multiple angles of the lift were already being edited into compilation videos. By morning, Carol would be famous, just not in the way she'd always wanted. But this was just the beginning. The war for Redwood Creek Estates had only begun, and the questions remained. What would Carol do next? How would the authorities respond? And most importantly, how long could a Lexus actually stay on a roof? Saturday morning arrived with a media circus that would have made P.T. Barnum jealous. News vans lined our street, reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and overhead a news helicopter circled like a mechanical vulture. The star of the show, Carol's white Lexus, sat on my roof, gleaming in the morning sun. The kid with the GoPro who'd stumbled onto our operation had posted his footage everywhere. adding another angle to what was already being called the most epic HOA takedown in history. But Carol herself remained hidden in her house, curtains drawn, probably plotting revenge while her car served as a four-wheeled monument to her downfall. The lawyers she sent scurried away when Gunny showed them the embezzlement evidence. The emergency HOA meeting at noon was standing room only. Elena, still technically secretary, called it to order with newfound confidence. The remaining board members looked shell-shocked, but determined. When the motion came to formally remove Carol as president, the vote was unanimous. Even her former allies abandoned ship, probably hoping to avoid scrutiny of their own actions. But the real moment came when Carol was required to appear. She entered through the side door, no longer the strutting peacock we all knew. Her usually perfect hair hung limp, her designer clothes replaced with a simple pantsuit. She stood at the podium, hands visibly shaking, as Elena read the charges. Financial malfeasance, abuse of power, violation of fiduciary duty. The room was dead silent. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elena asked. Carol opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again. No sound came. Her hand reached for the pen to sign her resignation, and it slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the table. The sound echoed in the silence like a judge's gavel. She signed with a shaking hand and fled without a word. The moment the door closed behind her, the room erupted in applause. Years of tyranny ended with the scratch of a pen. Justice, my grandfather would have said, sometimes comes in the quietest moments. But this was far from over. There was still a Lexus on my roof and a community to rebuild. The crane returned 3 days later for the great unlifting. By law and safety requirements, the car had to come down, but we were going to make it an event. The whole neighborhood gathered again, this time in broad daylight. Carol was legally required to be present for the removal of her property. She stood in my driveway, flanked by lawyers, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. As the crane hooked onto her car, Tommy Chen started another live stream. "Ladies and gentlemen, what goes up must come down, but the legend of Roof Lexus will live forever." The crowd was smaller, but no less enthusiastic. Kids had drawn pictures of cars on houses. Someone was selling "I survived the HOA wars" buttons. The Lexus descended slowly, majestically, rotating slightly as it came down. Carol had to watch every second, legally required to sign for receipt of her property. When the wheels touched her driveway, she practically ran to the car, key fob in hand. But when she pressed the button, nothing happened. The battery, it seemed, had died during its rooftop vacation. The tow truck arrival added insult to injury. As her Lexus was dragged away on a flatbed, the crowd offered mock sympathetic waves. Arthur summed it up best. "Pride goeth before a fall, but sometimes it needeth a little push." Carol climbed into a waiting Uber, her empire in ruins, her reputation destroyed, her Lexus heading for a repair shop. But I caught her expression as the car pulled away. This wasn't a defeat. This was regrouping. A month passed. Spring turned towards summer, and Redwood Creek Estates transformed. Without Carol's iron fist, neighbors started talking to each other again. The Murphys repainted their door any damn color they pleased. The Ungiens hung their cultural decorations with pride. Gardens grew wild and beautiful without fear of grass height violations. The new HOA board, led by Elena, focused on actual community issues instead of petty tyranny, and they even voted to reimburse residents for bogus fines, though the legal battle with Carol over the embezzled funds would take years. But something was building. I could feel it in the too polite letters from Carol's lawyers, in the way certain board members seemed nervous at meetings, in the unmarked cars that occasionally drove slowly past my house. Then came the invitation. A month after the great lifting, the new HOA board decided to throw a community barbecue. A celebration of new beginnings, Elena called it, though everyone knew it was really a victory party. The turnout was incredible. People brought food, drinks, and stories of Carol's tyranny that ranged from infuriating to absurd. The Hendersons told how she'd fined them for a garden gnome that was expressing inappropriate whimsy. The Patel family shared how she'd tried to ban the smell of curry from wafting outside their home. Each story was met with laughter instead of the old fear. We were healing, one shared meal at a time. As the sun set and the party wound down, Elena presented me with something special. A wooden plaque, hand-carved by Mr. Murphy, who turned out to be quite the craftsman. It read, "Redwood Creek Estates, don't mess with the roof. In memory of Arthur Hayes Sr., engineer and revolutionary." The crowd cheered as I accepted it, feeling my grandfather's presence so strongly I could almost hear his chuckle. This was what he'd wanted. Not just Carol's defeat, but the community's rebirth. People lingered as darkness fell, reluctant to let the evening end. String lights came out, someone brought a guitar, and the party evolved into something magical. Neighbors who'd barely spoken in years were sharing drinks and memories. Around 10 o'clock, as I was helping clean up, Elena pulled me aside. "You know," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "there's something you should know about Carol." I braced myself for bad news. "She's been quiet, but she hasn't given up. My sources say she's been meeting with developers, big ones, the kind that buy up whole neighborhoods." She paused, letting that sink in. But here's the interesting part. She still has that Mercedes. Bought it with HOA funds just like the Lexus, registered as a backup emergency vehicle. It's sitting in her garage right now. She handed me a folder. Every receipt, every fraudulent transaction, she was building herself a fleet on our dime. I stared at the papers, then looked up at my roof where the Lexus had sat just a month ago. The roof that could hold so much more. "Elena," I said slowly, "are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" She smiled, but it was complicated. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that if Carol tries to sell out our neighborhood to developers, if she attempts one more power play, well, Mercedes C-Classes are surprisingly aerodynamic." We stood there in the glow of the string lights, surrounded by our neighbors, our friends, our community. Carol might be plotting in the shadows, but we were ready. The first battle was won, but the war for Redwood Creek Estates might not be over. A neighbor I didn't recognize, well, a young woman from the far end of the street, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Sarah Chen, Tommy's older sister. I wanted to thank you. What you did inspired a lot of us younger residents. We're starting a community watch, but not for crime, for HOA abuse. We're calling it Roof Watch." She handed me a t-shirt with a simple logo, a house with a car on top. "We've got chapters starting in 3 other neighborhoods." Carol created a monster, just not the one she intended. I accepted the shirt with a mix of pride and bewilderment. My grandfather's revenge plan had become something bigger than either of us had imagined. As the last guests drifted away and I stood in my yard looking up at the stars, I thought about cycles. Carol's reign had ended, but nature abhors a vacuum. Someone or something would try to fill the power void she'd left. The developers Elena mentioned, other would-be tyrants, or maybe Carol herself, rebuilt and were vengeful. But we were ready now. We had proof that bullies could be beaten, that communities could unite, that sometimes the answer to tyranny was engineering, patience, and a really good crane operator. I went inside and pulled out my grandfather's journal one more time. In the back, tucked into the binding, I found one last note I'd missed before. "Remember, kiddo, it's not about the roof or the cars. It's about showing people they have power when they stand together. The crane is just a tool. The community is the real machine." The next morning, I installed the plaque on my porch where everyone could see it. A reminder and a warning. Don't mess with the roof, but more importantly, don't mess with each other. We were Redwood Creek Estates, and we'd learned to fight back. If Carol wanted round 2, she'd better bring more than a Mercedes. She'd need an army. Lucky for us, we already had one. The war might not be over, but for now, we have peace. And on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, I swear I could hear my grandfather laughing, proud of what his crazy plan had become. Fade to black.